The Quarantine Sessions podcast with Jacob.
Aidan Wachter. You are a sorcerer. So tell me about that. What is it like to be a self-proclaimed and kind of world-acknowledged sorcerer?
I think that I love the language if you don't get too highfalutin about it. And one of the things that kind of drew me to that title, other versus witchcraft and magic, was that it was a little less defined, more so now than it was when I started using it. And to me, what that is about is really just about kind of, it's a path of engagement with the world that you're in. And it's accepting that it's having effects on you and that you can have effects on it. And this is happening whether you want it to or not. It's just the nature of the experience. And so that it makes sense to me to try and dive in there and actually get involved.
Cool. Yeah. And you were talking about the word sorcerer in your new book, Weaving Fate, which I just finished and I really loved and would definitely recommend it to anybody who's interested in just diving into practical magic without even necessarily needing any prior experience, because the practices in it are very accessible. But you're talking about the idea of the word sorcerer having something to do with telling true lies. And I wanted to ask if you could kind of embellish on that, because that was just one of those things like, ooh, it sounds so tasty, you know?
So yeah, I'd been practicing magic, and my exposure was through mostly, at that time, I knew some Wiccans, and I knew one traditional witch, what we'd consider now a traditional witch, and a bunch of folks that were kind of Crowley, OTO magician folks. And I had moved to New Orleans and started spending a lot of time in the library at Tulane. And they had a great library. And kind of rooting around and working the card catalog back in those days and going like, okay, I found this. Where's this book that they're talking about? And so I began doing kind of really primitive, I'm not an academic, I left school few months into my second year of high school. So this really kind of like probably insane take on etymology research in the Tulane Library. And I began looking at what are they describing in all of these different schools of magic? Like, what are they saying witchcraft is? What are they saying magic is? What are they saying sorcery is? And looking at word roots and finding, in early versions of Indo-European dictionaries and all that stuff. And one of the things that I came up with, and this is such a crazy period of time that I'm not going to say you're going to find a book that says this exactly, but through this process of kind of running back and forth through this huge library when it was too hot to be out in the real world in New Orleans, I came across this explanation of the term was, I found out later, I kind of reconstructed my notes at some point, for warlock, which has a connotation of oath breaker, is usually the one that you see. But one of the descriptions that I pieced together etymologically was that a warlock was one who tells the true lie. And I loved like you said, I loved the language behind it. I'm like, well, that's a fascinating concept. If that's, and I'm never super interested in whether this is valid academically. Like, is there something contained in the idea of anything we come across that is freeing and empowering? And so I became really fascinated with this as a description of magic, where we're doing rituals, and we see this in all sorts of what, traditionally what you call primitive societies, though I don't really think that that's appropriate language, but where you're doing some kind of a ritual that evokes a different outcome than the one that is expected. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing. That's kind of lying, right? You're kind of saying this thing is happening, whether that is the big animals are coming back through your camp or the weather is changing at a particular point than what it is. And you're doing something with that process. And I thought, okay, that's a great explanation of magic, that's kind of, in a way, you're speaking something into being true that isn't true at the moment when you're speaking it. And so that's the kind of concept behind telling true lies.
Mm. It's like you're telling a lie in the moment that reality then conforms to, so it's no longer a lie when that moment in the future arrives.
Exactly.
Cool. Yeah. Something I really love that you're talking about on another podcast I listened to with you was just kind of, in a way, rejecting that academic approach. You're talking about your biggest takeaway with chaos magic was just that magic works. And it relates a little bit to this kind of famous Peter J. Carroll quote that magic works in practice, but not in theory.
Right.
And there's something empowering about actually trying to liberate yourself out of the, academic model of trying to find explanations for particular things, or even a scientific model of needing, evidence to support the validity of something. Magic seems to work, and it works in a variety of different ways, and a lot of people have a lot of different approaches to it. But I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what your personal definition of magic is, and if you have any kind of theory as to how it works.
Mm-hmm. So if I don't know if you've read Six Ways as well, but my first book.
I would love to, but I can't quite get it until you release the ebook. So I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely. One of the things I started doing in Six Ways, and it had happened previously in some other writing, is I decided that instead of trying to come up with a definition of magic, that I would kind of come up with definitions of magic that were situationally appropriate. And so I have tons of them. And part of that was to break that idea that we have a set definition of this thing, right? It's like, because then you go, if you have a single definition, no matter how all-encompassing you try and make it, there's all of these situations where that one's not valid. So what if that's not really what's important, but that we accept that there are possibly innumerable definitions of magic that will be individually useful depending on the moment, right? Literally. And so I talk about magic as being the art of falling in love with the field and its inhabitants. And that's one of my preferred ones, which is basically, how do you develop that kind of engagement? And in Six Ways, I talk about this as being, if you think about that, the process of meeting someone and falling in love with them, even if this is purely a chemical, physical thing, not if we're not talking about kind of deeper levels of that, there's this process that we all know, if we've had this, where you become really fascinated with someone and you become super attentive to them, to their gestures, to their looks, to their inflections, to their body language, to their smell, to their taste. And all of these things produce kind of recursive feedback loops that deepen that effect, right? And this is often why people have trouble in long-term relationships, is that kind of breaks down over time. But there's a function there in that process of kind of this loop, spiraling, tightening loop of information feedback that is drawing you closer and closer to something. And I think this is a really good, it's one of my favorite ways I think about magic, because it kind of shows that it's not about how much do you know, it's about how much are you willing to engage, are you willing to be vulnerable, are you willing to be exposed, and kind of ride that current, right? And so to me, that's kind of a description of the ritual practice in a way. It's not about knowing what color you're projecting into the east to like try and get the right thing to respond. It's like, no, can you actually fall in love with the thing you're doing in that moment to such a degree that you become kind of enmeshed with it?
Yeah.
And so we could just work on that one here. And so how I think it works is something that I refer to as, I often state that my kind of map of the world is one of biological animism. And so animism is the idea that potentially everything that you interact with could have a spirit of some sort or an intelligence or sentience of some sort. So you could actually interact with stones, with the volcano, with the sea, or within specific currents within the sea, right? Schools of fish, right? Particular fish. Forests, or a particular part of a forest or a tree. And this could be that it's innate to that, or kind of the root idea behind this in a lot of cultures is that there are spirits that indwell certain things, certain phenomena. So it's not necessarily saying that stones are alive, but some stones may have some aspect of being alive. It's more the take. But overall, the thing that I always fall back to is looking at it as a biological system. So if what I call the field, which is what most people would call reality, right? And what some people would call God, that's not really my perspective. That this whole structure that we exist in is this sentient system. And it responds to us. And it doesn't respond to us in kind of the way that I think people often think of, which is that we humans are super special and therefore God smiles upon us if we do certain things in a particular way, which is really moralistic. But instead that there are ways you can interact with your world that it tends to respond to. And that there are these, in my mind, there are very clearly these spiritual agencies or these indwellers, or however you want to view it, ancestral dead, things like that, that are available to interact with if you kind of are willing to go there, if you're willing to take the steps to be sincerely there. And so magic then is that process. So that's the art and falling in love with the field. Its inhabitants is, can you make that engagement? Can you drop kind of your, in a sense, it's kind of like, again, like that process of falling in love or even in lust with someone in the moment. There's a part of our ego that falls off when we do that, right? There's a part of there's some aspect of kind of the super solidity of ourselves that we allow to become really permeable. And I think magic requires that and responds to that.
Mm. Yeah, living here in Bali, they have that animistic perspective towards everything, even to the extent where I've heard stories that, somebody's refrigerator isn't working, they will, give offerings to the indwelling spirit of the refrigerator and things like that. But I think their perspective is naturally and inherently very magical, that, for whatever reason, culturally, they never lost a connection with that kind of deeper sense, which I think is actually our origin as a human culture that we kind of come out of. Like that perspective is more natural, actually, in a lot of ways.
I totally agree with that.
We've been, for whatever reason, co-opted out of that. I wanted to ask you, though, do you feel that magic is something that anybody can do? We were talking a bit before we started the conversation about how there are certain initiatory systems of magic that are very inaccessible, it seems, on purpose to try to uphold some kind of elitism or superiority, or for some other purpose, perhaps. But it sounds like what you're talking about is pretty accessible to basically anybody that has the sincere enough ambition to practice or to build a relationship with the field around them.
I think it is, and I agree. I absolutely think that this is the natural state for humans, is to have that going on. I think where it's kind of funny on the magical side, for whatever reason, there, like we were talking about, there's particular organizations, particular groups, particular systems that are based on really rigid kind of hierarchical models, which have never made sense to me. Because I don't really see that in action in the natural world. Like there's organic hierarchy that occurs, right? In a forest or whatever, there's succession of plants, succession of animals, things like that happen. And to me, I don't see why kind of the human experience would be different than that, right? We've kind of created a world where it appears to be, but I don't really go for that as being particularly real on a kind of deep level. And so I think magic is accessible to everyone. Part of the difficulty is that we don't have the same kind of innate structures or talents. So like I have a particular skill set that is kind of, I think, innate to me. And I'm able to do particular things more easily than others. And there's some stuff I can't do well at all. And it took me a long time to really realize, like, okay, this is the same as like, I'm an endurance athlete, and I will break myself trying to kind of approach kind of power sports, right? If I try and go into Olympic lifting, things like that, my structure doesn't like it. I'm not a fast twitch guy, right? I don't actually have the structure for that sport, but I can run essentially forever. And I pick it up really fast, even if I haven't done it for a very long time. And that just kicks in really fast, right? So if I accept that that's true, which has been proven as much as I would like to try and make it the other way sometimes, magic is the same way. And so if we believe there's only one way into magic, we're basically saying everybody that can't get into that via selection bias, they already have the basis for that, can't play, right? And I think that's just ridiculous. You know, you go, come on, nothing else works that way. We're totally accepting that some people are kind of wired to music or wired to dance or wired to, like I said, power sports. Wired to be really amazing with machines. And I think magic is the same. And so a lot of what I try and put forward is like, there's not a right way into this stuff. There's finding what works for you and then going really hard there, because that's where you're going to get rewarded. It's not trying to beat yourself up over all the things you can't do. And realize that some of that stuff will open up later, right? It's kind of like, one of the big things that I found is that there's things that seemed blocked to me when I started that then opened up to me much later. And it's kind of like, maybe it's like a video game where you have to come in through this one door and you know what you want is like 10 feet through a wall on the other side of that door, but you can't get there without this circuitous route, right? So I think it's absolutely available to everyone, and I think it's totally just innate to the species. But I think the form it takes is very different from person to person.
Yeah, that kind of more high magic, as it's called, approach is a bit more academic and often has a lot of really rigid systems and symbol sets that are very dense and complicated. But I definitely think that there is a particular kind of mind or a particular kind of person that just more gravitates towards that. And like you're saying, that's just a more kind of compatible approach to magic, you know, whereas other people might be more inclined towards like divination or towards building talismans as you do, or things like this, all the many different facets of magic. I wanted to ask, if somebody was listening to this and they had never attempted to practice magic in any way that they're consciously aware of, what is a good kind of first exercise that somebody could do to begin to explore their inherent magical capabilities?
I go to something that's in 6 ways, but it's also on my blog. And so if you go to my website, there's aidanwachter.com, go to the blog, and just in the little search bar for the blog, type in Reclaiming Right. And the reclaiming rite is a 3-part little ritual that is a combination of kind of basically calling back your personal power, accepting that you have personal power, and releasing a bunch of blockages. It's very easy. It's a little 5-minute thing after the first time you do it. First time it might take you 10 minutes. You don't have to know anything to do it. You just want, preferably a little cup or bowl of water and a candle. My suggestion is a picture of yourself. And for most people, if you do that every day for 30 days, you will see pretty radical changes. And some folks are already kind of wired to that they've already got that down, and so they don't notice as much. But for most people that I find, that's what I put forward as the basic practice, because I find that it does the most immediate good. It's not trying to contact spirits. It's not trying to enforce your will on the world or anything that people can have kind of, I think, intelligently good questions about to start. It's really just about how do you get grounded and centered and drop some of the shit that's been put on you by our society, our culture, our families, all that stuff, and retract some of that stuff that we have all lost to that, and bring it back to us so we can work from that position.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really loved the Feverstone exercise that you outlined in Weaving Fate, and the idea that we have this naturally creative ability that gets kind of kicked up and blocked through traumas, and basically our body's protection mechanism to try to protect us against these really unpleasant feelings and emotions. Like it reminded me of work that I've done with either ayahuasca or with holotropic breath work, these kinds of journeys back into my past and meeting past versions of myself. And these are things that have occurred spontaneously without really a lot of conscious effort. And I really loved also your corridor exercise, because in my own visualizations and meditations, I've often invoked a corridor that I've walked down and done that same thing naturally. And reading your book was kind of like a confirmation, like, whoa, there's other people that do that too, which was really, really cool.
That was very cool. When I started sharing that one, that was the first thing, is a bunch of people popped up going like, I absolutely do this. And I didn't know that this was even something that would be qualified as magic, right? And again, it kind of falls into that locked down model of what is magic, what is not magic. And that, to me, when I discovered it, was like, oh, this is one of the better magical tools. And again, it doesn't require you to really know anything. It requires you to be able to relax and kind of daydream a little bit. And that's really it. And yet it's really incredibly potent. Power, a little powerhouse.
For sure. And kind of like healing and integrating and getting your head on straight seems like a really important preliminary step before getting into ritual magic and things like that. Just kind of, healing traumas and making sure that your intentions in regards to the magic that you're working is in the right place. Because like if somebody has a large pain body that they've accumulated through a lot of trauma and grief, and that's what they're carrying into the magic process, I could see that would potentially have some damaging effects to the people in their lives and perhaps on themselves. But if somebody is already in a very clear and grounded and open heart space, I think that the magic has a much higher potential to yield positive results.
I totally agree. I got that, I got my take on that a long time ago, talking to one of 3 British guys that I met in the 90s, who has basically said something along the lines, I wish I could remember which of them it was so I could credit them, but he basically said something along the lines of, we all have all this damage, and this damage is like this fount of raw power. If we can go in there, and if we don't and this is language that I came up with much later, is the way that I think about it is we tend to take the traumas that we're aware of and we create what I call museums out of them. And so the museum is like, in my case, you know, my son died a couple of years ago. And it would be very easy, and it's socially totally acceptable for me to kind of fall into what I would say is a grief museum, where my initial experience of that loss is now permanentized. And so now I can't have a relationship with him other than that, right? But again, as an animist and as somebody who has ancestor tied in stuff, I absolutely can have a relationship with him. So why is that the moment and the sensation that I grab onto, right? And I think we often have these growing up that, as you said, there's all these points where something happens and we kind of anchor to the trauma. And you can't really walk away from it. You have to do something if that occurs. That's what, you know, the brothers taught me about the fever stone, is they're like, sometimes nothing happens. It's like you get hit and you just got hit. And sometimes you got hit and you're just damaged. And until you do something with that damage to release it, it's affecting everything. You may not see it as affecting everything. And some things are really major. And so we go, yeah, I know that terrible thing happened. And so I'm aware of it, right? But there's so many layers of this stuff. And so I think if we can work through those processes, it doesn't have to be the fever stone process, but some kind of work to do that. How do we actually shed that stuff? Because that power is trapped in there. That's a chunk of you that you can't use in its natural state. You can only use it in the way that it's skewed by that trauma. And so to me, it's a critical piece for me, that's for sure.
Yeah. I think it should be a critical piece to anybody who's interested in magical work, because it's going to improve the results of your magic, I believe, no doubt, because you're going to have more creative sort of power accessible. And also it's going to change the types of things that you're going to want to enchant for, you know, so it's going to, by kind of becoming more in alignment with your higher self, then you're going to have a clearer direction to go in. And, you know, you're going to want to use magic for different things, possibly with more kind of altruistic, a more altruistic bent to it. But something I wanted to say also is that it seems like, so in my experience, that's why I think breath work and also psychedelics are very effective. A lot of the time, these kinds of traumas that block us they're buried away in our unconscious, and they become what a lot of psychologists call the shadow. Right. You know, so in my experience on ayahuasca, for example, I've had experiences where I have this memory that comes to my mind, and I relive a particular experience that I completely forgot about. It was completely pushed out of my conscious mind. And I was carrying the weight of this particular experience without even realizing it. And then by being able to revisit it and do something that's very similar to the work that you were talking about in the fever stone and release it, then it's like, you know, I'm dropping a weight that I didn't even know I had.
Right. And that weight is, and I think that's exactly it. And that weight, the thing that I think is so interesting is that weight is like literally the different, if we think about it as weight, it's like, if we think of all these traumas as being stacked on our body, right? It's totally impacting your ability to move. It's impacting your ability to do everything all the time. And so, yeah, it helps clear things for your magic, but it also means that you're more likely to be able to show up in a relationship rather than show up as that person with exactly that weight sitting on them. You go, oh, okay, I've had this experience with the fever stone work and other stuff, other methods of getting there, where I've been in a relationship where there's a particular event that happens or a particular kind of cycle of events that happen, and I respond in a very specific way that I'm aware is not beneficial, but I have no control over, right? And through things like the fever stone work, or like you said, breath work is definitely another one, where something is blown out, I've cleared something out, and I don't even know that it's related to that effect that happens in that relationship. Like there's no part of me that goes, oh, this is that, and now that part of my relationship's gonna be awesome. I don't have that experience. But the next time I'll be in that place and those kind of stimuli arise in a relationship that would normally set me down a very specific path, I just don't go down that path. And I can see it, and I can see it on the other person because they like know where it's going. It's like they're dreading it, right? They're like, I gotta say this, and it never goes well, right? Mm-hmm. And they say it, and they're like, wait a second, he didn't lose his shit. Right? What is that? And it's like, that is one of those kind of blockages, or one of those trapped chunks, one of those stones that have been processed and they're no longer controlling your responses. You know, so to me, it's a huge thing.
There's something kind of magical about that also, because you're resolving this stuff from an internal place that has a direct impact on your external life. So even though you're not, you know, invoking something or doing some kind of enchantment or working, it is still a magical process. And I think that it was interesting in the book you mentioned, you know, Mircea Eliade and Carlos Castaneda as being two primary influences for you as a magician. And because I always put Carlos Castaneda and Eliade in the sort of shamanism category, but I think that there actually is a very deep relationship between shamanism and magic, you know, and there's kind of like a popular lore around, if you're going to Peru to drink ayahuasca, to be careful, you might end up with like a sorcerer, you know, and they kind of get like a bad rap. But I do know that in the same cultures that work, that shamanistic cultures, that magic is a big part of those cultures. And a lot of the techniques that they use for healing, they also use for enchantment and things like that.
I think it's all one thing, not to say that a shamanic culture or a shamanic practitioner is necessarily a sorcerer, but again, if we kind of come with that idea of the field, it's the same kind of interactions, right? These are spirit interactions, they're energetic interactions, they're power interactions with between individuals, between kind of what I call the others, kind of the external powers. And so I think that there's a very clear connection. I would say that they share roots, right? That shamanism and sorcery share roots. There's a great thing in Apocalyptic Witchcraft by Peter Gray, where he says, you know, that witchcraft is always, and I'm going to get this wrong, but he says is you know, defined at the other end of the finger that is pointing, basically, right? And so this, right. We see this, and we see this in a lot of cultures, that if I'm doing it and I'm the good guy, the person that did this to you is the bad guy and is the witch or the sorcerer. But the systems are kind of similar. They may have different self-views, right? Yeah, to me, it's definitely, you're all in the same, you're on the same field. The game may be being played slightly differently, but it's all happening on the same field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that sorcerers or witches get a bad rap just in general, and it has to do with kind of our ideas around what that means. I think it invokes an idea of being highly manipulative and coercive, you know, mm-hmm. to force upon some kind of outcome that's against the will of others or against the well-being of others. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that. And, you know, in like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, there's a deep history of magical practice, but their intention for using magic, and it's like really hardcore magic, is to try to awaken and liberate all sentient beings. So it's really about, like, it's not magic itself that's a problem. It's more of the intention of the person using it. That's an issue.
Totally. And it's also really interesting. I mean, I love that example because of, you know, if we take the document that is published in English, at least, as The Lotus Born, that was written by one of Padmasambhava's consorts, who's the guy who brought Tibetan Buddhism to Tibet, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they sent him in. If you read that, and the way that I read it, at least, it says that this guy is actually crazy enough and on it enough and badass enough to go play the game that these Bon shaman or sorcerers, however you want to view them, play. And it wasn't, I've heard people try and describe that book as being filled with metaphors about things that don't seem like that. But it was kind of a bloodbath. It was like he went in to kind of like, I'm going to go do war with you to show you that this way is more powerful. It's like a kung fu movie kind of thing is how I read that thing, you know, old kung fu movie.
Wow.
I'm going to come and show you that my kung fu is way more badass than y'all's. And so it's a really interesting thing. And then he integrated that Bon shamanism or sorcery into Buddhism. And this is what we get as Tibetan Buddhism, right? And so again, I think it's all happening in the same field. Perceptions can be very different. And it also ties into who is describing what occurred or why it occurred. Is that the actual practitioner? Is that whoever came out on top of that conflict? We see this all the time. It's if you look at the early, even in Eliade even, there's a lot of things that are said in there that are clearly kind of colonial perspectives that you go, okay, dude, it's like, I love that book because it's one of the earliest forms of that thing and it's not as codified. And it's very easily understandable by most people, but there's a lot in there that is cringy because it's like, this is so much, he is viewing it from the perspective that his angle is superior to the people practicing. And I'm always like, well, what did they think they were doing? What did they say they were doing? And I don't want the interpretation. I want to sit with what they say they're doing. And how does that feel? And what does that mean to me? And can I begin to kind of touch in on a really instinctual level to the culture at that time, which is impossible to do in any real way, I think. But it does help to go, if I can break out of my kind of codified mental state that I have as, you know, a dude that grew up in suburban California in the 70s. What are they really saying when I look at the myths went on? What are they really saying in things like the Icelandic sagas? What are they saying went on when they're talking about these processes that are either shamanism or magic? And if I can kind of try and see through, you know, in the Icelandic sagas is an easy one. If we kind of look through the early Icelandic Christian views of the guys who wrote the stuff down, what's really in there? And we don't get it all because it wasn't written by the practitioner. But what does it show us about that? Like all of this kind of culture-wide discussion of shape-shifting that occurs, you know, pretty much everywhere. Has different forms, different animals, different reasons, whether it's good or whether it's a bad thing, whether it's bad magic or whether it's healing magic. What is that process? What are they actually talking about? And why is it such a recurrent thing? I was reading a thing from my friend Chawan Koo. She wrote a really good article for Pop Sugar recently about the starseed thing. And that's not my thing. But if we look at starseed, or if we look at the Nephilim stories in the Bible, and the kind of apocryphal stuff there, if we look at some of the, again, there's things coming out of Nepal and Tibet, there's things coming out of Native American cultures that indicate that there is a blending of types of people that led to a particular kind of new kind of person, right? If we were talking kind of modern sci-fi or horror movies or whatever, we're talking about hybrids, right? What lies behind all that stuff? And is that it's such a constant current. All of these stories are such constant currents, and we can kind of fixate on the specificity of the mythologies or the specificity of the folklore, but what is actually going on in there? Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate occurrence within, you know, academia, is that we tend to filter other cultures' stories through our own lenses and interpret them, and rather than just kind of taking them for what they are and trying to wrap our heads around the way that the person indigenous to that culture would actually see it. And sometimes it's quite condescending, actually. It's like, oh, like, isn't it cute that they think about things this way? Or, you know, even if you acknowledge their beliefs, you still disqualify them in some way. But what's comes up for me as you're talking about this that's interesting is just the power behind story in general, and how that is such a big part of magic, that it's kind of the stories that we tell about ourselves and about reality that enforces and turns the wheel of manifestation of what becomes real. And this really ties into your practice, which is kind of the fundamental practice in Weaving Fate, of hypersigils, which is also, as an artist, something that really fascinates me. And I love this idea even that the earliest cave paintings that exist, which are some of the oldest examples of art that we have, might have been hypersigils, where you could paint a bison with a bunch of spears in it, and people would, you know, do rituals in a cave somewhere. And then in their mind, that is assuring that being a higher probability. Then they go out and they hunt and they kill the bison. They're like, look, it worked. That was a magic act. But yeah, that's just really fascinating. I'd love to hear you talk more about hypersigils.
Well, I think it's that, and the hypersigil thing, I won't go into kind of the pop culture side of that because it's out there, but if we view that, in a way, we're narrative beings, right? This is kind of the thing that theoretically, whether we know this or not, I don't know that my dogs don't do this thing to some degree, but I make up this story about everything that I encounter, right? If we're looking at things like really hardcore meditation to kind of no mind states, this is an attempt to stop that story, right? Well, what's the value of stopping that story? And it's that you become aware that you are actually generating story all the time, right? It's not that stopped state is some awesome thing. It's just like all of a sudden when your mind starts coming up with shit, you go, well, that's not really relevant. That's a bunch of bullshit. That's my mom's voice. That's me when I was 19. That's right. This is what we get out of stopping the story. And so hypersigils are a different approach. And they're saying, if we're going to generate story all the time, let's generate story that produces the life that we're after. And just take total responsibility for that internal narrative. And so you can do this in tons of different ways. You can do it through painting. You can do it through art. I absolutely agree on the cave art. And the process of it is, again, it ties into that kind of feedback loop concept, that we begin telling stories about how we want things to be, and we all simultaneously begin attempting to do the mundane work to shift our life in the world in that same direction. And because of the fact that we've been producing this kind of magical narrative, any little piece that falls into place, our mind goes, this is totally working. This is generating that thing. So now we begin to go, oh, I don't have total control over everything, because there's everything else in the universe has also got, you know, consciousness and kind of will, if we want to view it that way. But I can interface. I can actually say, I want my life to look totally different. And I can start writing about what that is. I can start painting that. I was thinking about it the other day, like really successful Instagram influencers, right, are doing this thing. This is hypersigil work. They are producing a life, an appearance of a life that if they're successful, they might end up living. It's a very mundane view of it, right? But I think about, like, there was a kind of famous, just massive steroid abusing bodybuilder, Rich Pena, who died a few years ago from all of that stuff. But, and it was totally known that Rich would like rent really expensive cars to do his videos. And now this is shifty, is one way of viewing it, right? You go, but again, is he telling true lies? Well, his companies eventually got him to the place where more of that was true. It's a form of hypersigil. To me, it's a very basic one, right? It's very just cash driven, which is not my interest. But if we can, again, come in and go, okay, my narrative tells me that I can't have an actually fulfilling relationship for whatever reason. Yes, I should do the work to try and get to the root of that, which is something we can do with corridor work, fever stone work, breath work, therapy. The other side of that is to really begin visualizing and writing down or painting or whatever method you use to generate the alternative narrative where that's no longer true. Where you go, no, my relationships work because I show up for them. Here's how I show up for them. Here's what happens. Here's how I respond to adversity. Here's how I respond from a more altruistic self when I would normally get angry. All of these things can get worked into the hypersigil, and they tend to produce a very radical effect for most folks. So we're narrative beings. So kind of step one of magic, whether people view it this way, is you're kind of saying, I want things to be different, and this is the story of how I want it to be different. And the hypersigil is just a very, especially the way that I talk about it, I think, because most people can journal, and it's a journal form. It's a very direct way to say, no, this is what I want. And I'm going to it gives you a way to imagine it, even if you aren't good at visualizing, and really concretize it by writing it down. You can revisit it and go, oh yeah, that's what happened. You go back in and read that thing. If you're maybe not feeling it this morning, you go back in and go, oh, look at all this stuff. Look at all this stuff that happened to me. Technically, it didn't happen to you. But I'm not sure how much the mind in that kind of field knows that. I think it begins to pick up on that current of different, like, oh, we're beginning to get the signal in a clear fashion, often for the first time. And there's a way that you could say that people who are successful in a real sense, not people that have the appearance of success, but people who are actually very happy with themselves and their lives, I think it's just that their internal narrative is actually accurate to who they are. But for most of us, we've been messed up on all sorts of different levels from all sorts of different influences. And so we have to kind of, we have to get in the car and drive it to that destination. It's not natural for us.
Mm-hmm. I think the social media example is really interesting, that you could totally use a social media profile as a hypersigil. And I know people who are like, high-end coaches and stuff who have done that same thing, where they weren't actually making a lot of money, and then they created the appearance that they were making a lot of money by renting expensive villas or things like that.
Totally.
And then suddenly they have like all these, clients that are paying them like $10,000 for session work or whatever it is. So that is magic in a way. But for those who are listening to this and they're not aware of what it is, the Black Book practice is a kind of long form journaling where you write from the perspective of what you want to occur as already having had occurred. And I've started doing this since I read your book, and it's been really fun. And one of the really fun things about it is that we have ideas about what we want. We say it would be nice for this, but we don't usually really go deep into that experience and really feel into what that would be like. And as I've been doing the Black Book journal entries, I've found that my imagination, it broadens very much my expectations of what living that experience would actually be like, with a lot of small details that I never really considered before. And it's been really fun, to kind of, at least vicariously for now, get to live out these kind of fantasy experiences and to think about, oh wow, like I never thought about that aspect of it, but it's true, it would be like that, things like that.
I think it's a really fascinating process, and I love that aspect of it. And for me, there'll be occasional really quick responses to Black Book work, but usually there's like a 3 to 6 month lag. And there's this really strange event that I have that happens. And I've been doing this for a long time, and it still happens, where I'll be like halfway through a really good week, and I'll be like, oh, wait a second. I know I wrote a version of this. It's not the same, it's not like you're going to get the same thing precisely of what you wrote. That's why I talk so much about working off of the feeling of it. But I'll have that moment where I'm in a location, or I'm with a person, or I'll meet a person, and I just like, there's a little kind of tickle in the back of your head, and you go, oh yeah, this is that thing actually manifesting, and this is how it's coming about, and that's fascinating, right? And that produces this other level of engagement. And, you know, in my mind, kind of the wrong engagement would be, how precise does it match up? That's not relevant. It's like, is this the life that I kind of am steering towards, right? Is this closer in? And you go, oh yeah, wait a second. I can see the kinds of opportunities I was describing, even if they're not exactly the same, open up. I can see, I've had the experience of like waking up and realizing that, like, you know, when I wake up in the morning, I'm not waking up feeling the same as I did a couple months ago. And if I go back and kind of skim the black books, you go, oh yeah, this is actually what I was asking. And so I think it's a way of communicating to our unconscious or subconscious minds, to the field at the whole, to our allies, to our ancestors. This is what I would like my life to be like. And to me, it's been a really beautiful, beautiful thing. And again, I like it because it's super low tech. You don't need to know. You don't need to learn Hebrew or Sanskrit or any of that stuff to do it.
Right. Yeah, and it's something that anybody can just start doing, and it's a universal thing, and it's also pretty not scary. You know,
Totally.
You don't need to summon any demons or anything like that, or the kind of stuff that seems to, you know, scare people when it comes down to practicing magic. But I wanted to ask you a couple kind of like technical and theoretical questions about the Black Book, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Do you burn your Black books when you finish them?
I usually burn the book, not the book that is immediately before the one that I'm working on, but everything before that I burn. And I really do this because I move a lot. And I would have, you know, a shelf of these things, and I don't have any reason for it. So I long ago decided that, same thing with regular sigils, graphic sigils that I do, I burn all of them. I decided that that was kind of the symbolic way I was going to free them once we'd kind of got the baseline down. Once we'd kind of sent the message, they didn't need to be there any longer, and they could be freed up and free up all that energy.
Yeah, I just asked because in working with regular sigils, I've found that if you burn them at least a period after you use them, that it does seem to free something up. Like there's a feeling of release or something like that. Like, okay, like I free you, and now like you can go about and do your will. So I was just wondering if you could apply that same principle to the Black Book, that you create this condensation.
Yeah, I didn't, you know, it happened. I got into that on accident. I moved to New Orleans in I think 92 or 93 from San Francisco, where I lived for quite a while. And I had a huge stack of journals, and a couple of the earliest forms of the Black books were in there. And on my way out of town, I'd left my apartment and was house sitting for somebody for the last month before I left. And again, I had this big stack of these things in a box of sigils. And I said, this is stupid. There's no reason to carry all this stuff. And so I had kind of the ritual several night process of using their fireplace and burning all these things. And I had this really clear like release and like relief of like, okay, everything is changing all the time. I'm changing all the time. Magic to me is absolutely about change. Why do I need to have this kind of codified history of what I've done or what I've wanted or what I've asked for? It doesn't make any sense. So to me, burning is the logical thing. I'm not much of a hoarder. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it wasn't something that you wrote about in your book, but it was just something that to me seemed kind of like a logical step that you might want to do that after you finish the book.
There's actually a footnote about it. So
okay,
there is a footnote about it, but
yeah. Right on. Yeah, I wanted to ask kind of just like a perspective on sigils and hypersigils in general, because I know the most famous example of the hypersigil is Grant Morrison's Invisibles. And from what I've heard from him in his talks, he was of the opinion that by other people reading the Invisibles, it was charging the hypersigil, that it was giving it charge and power through the attention of other people. In the Black Book, I would assume that for the most part, you're not going to show those entries to other people. And I'm curious if you think that a hypersigil would have more of an impact if it is given attention by other people besides yourself.
I believe that if the kind of goal is to generate kind of power on the outer with other people, that there's a definite argument for creating a form that you can share, in which case, to me, it wouldn't be the Black Book unless you were novelizing it or something. But for all of my uses, I find that keeping it to myself and keeping it as kind of a journal is hugely effective, and again, knocks out some of the weirdness.
Yeah.
I really don't want other people's input on much of the magic that I do. Because usually I think what I'm asking doesn't necessarily make sense to other people anyway, because it's very personal. Like there's no way I could describe why I want my day to have a particular feeling sense to it. That would really matter. Anyone's kind of attention to that for me is almost a negative. It's one of the things that, you know, there's a lot of view of we have to keep the secrets silent, and that's what why silence is important in magic. And I totally disagree. I think that it's like a container, and it allows it to operate quietly. And so the results tend to be, for me, way gentler. I used to do a lot of kind of performance art related magic, and the results were always a little over the top. They were not stable. I used to do a lot of kind of installation work in San Francisco, in alleys, where I would set up things and leave them.
Cool.
And it absolutely worked. But it was always a little over the top. There was always like some really strange aspects to it. And so I really moved to being pretty much completely, I keep it to myself what I do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your opinion about sigils in general, because I heard you talk about in another podcast that you used to say like carve a sigil into like a stick and maybe like bleed on it a little bit and then bury it, and then that would have an impact. So It seems like one perspective on sigils is that it's the symbol themselves that has sort of power, regardless of kind of how much attention you give to them in your conscious mind. And then another perspective on sigils is that it's very important to uphold the image of the sigil in your mind's eye through either meditation or, you know, people use orgasm to like imprint them deep into your subconscious and things like that. But, you know, does the sigil have power by itself? Could you, you know, just create the sigil and bury it and not need to focus on the image of it or think about it or uphold it as an image in your mind's eye and it still have power?
Yeah, I mean, I started sigils with the kind of second kind of hold it in your mind, visualize it during orgasm, do whatever. I did a lot of pain work that way.
Right.
You know, self-piercing and things like that. It worked. But over time, what I found is that if I could kind of translate that falling in love process into the actually creating the sigil, I didn't find that I really needed to do anything with them. That engagement, that involvement, that kind of feedback loop of me being really into it. And you do a lot of art, so you've had that experience. You do beautiful art.
Thank you.
If we can kind of bring that affection and intention to the creation of the thing, I believe that kind of frees the whole thing. It's like it's done when I'm done drawing it, really. So it's like, you know, I have piles of them taped to the wall because I like having them around. And then periodically I go like, that batch is done, and I'll pull them out and burn them. But Yeah, to me, it's about the moment that it's created in. It's like, can you really be present in that creation with that kind of odd distancing is the power, is the thing I would say for me with sigils is I do have a method that I use to create them in groups, so I don't know which sigil is which. I know that what they're overall for. Like if I do 10 sigils, I know that there's, 10 different intentions in there, but I don't know which one is which after the first few minutes of the process of making them. And so I think I'm really engaging with them as individuals and really like, I just want to give you a really good birth, right? And then I'm just going to release you. And that seems to me, again, it works better for me, and I get less weirdness.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. I was also, your talismanic jewelry is absolutely beautiful. It's a shame that you're not making it anymore, because I would love to get one. But I was curious also about your process around consecrating magical objects and creating talismans. I'm a tattoo artist as well as a painter, and I attempt in the tattoo process to basically do talismanic tattoo work. So to create a ritual around the process, to have people focus on an intention, to use incense, things like that, to try to, really try to create a charge around that so that it impacts people in a profound way. But I was curious about your own process when you're creating the talismans, if there's anything particular that you do ritualistically or...
I'm like, it's actually funny because I'm like almost devoid of anything that looks like obvious ritual anymore. Though I've been at this for a very long time. It did not start that way. I'll do this. You put these up on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So like I'm just going to flip the camera around so I will disappear everybody. And I don't know what you'll see, but you can tell me if you can see what's going on here, Jake.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that is just me making offerings to my allies for, in this case, for this piece of work that you and I are doing.
Oh, wow. Great.
So it's like, okay, I'm going to talk to him. We're going to be trying to do this. This is set up to try and transmit in a really clear way. We're covering a long distance here, so I've got some road opening work done. But these individual pieces are now very simple. I'm not intoning anything anymore. I really do walk in and go, hey, I'm going to be calling this guy in Bali. Let's have a good Zoom connection. Let's have a good talk. Let me be pretty clear, even though it's like probably early morning for you and getting close to bedtime for me. And so it's just really kind of bringing that intention in. And for me, because my work is so spirit-based, it's 90% offerings to my allies. And somebody asked me, I said that to somebody recently in a private conversation, and they said, so does that mean that you think that 90% of the power resides in your allies? And I was like, no. I just think that 90% of the effects I get out of the work that I do is best spent on them. That's where I get the most bang for my buck, right? And so that's the process that I do for talismanic work when I'm doing it, whether it's jewelry or whether it's anything else, is I just want to be really present. I want to be really engaged. I tend to talk continuously, whether that's to the thing or to the allies, however you want to view it. I don't really care. I'm not attached to anybody seeing it the way that I see it. And telling every piece what I think about it. So like there's rue and hyssop for kind of protection and clearing on the altar. So as I engage with those things, I'm going to tell them why I'm doing it. So it's their nature is protective. So I'm going to kind of say, hey, as your nature is to be protective, I would love you to do that for us now. Same thing. If I'm lighting a candle for my allies, I'm just saying, I'm lighting candles for my allies that they can be nourished and strengthened, and that they can nourish and strengthen the work that I'm doing. It's very plain spoken. As I've said in a lot of podcasts, and I repeat it a lot because I get a lot of feedback from it, that it's good for people to hear. I also think it's really important, if you're going to do magical work, if you're going to do offering work, if you're going to work with allies, be really honest. And so I regularly walk in here and go light a candle and pour them some water and go, I'm a fucking mess today and I could use some help. And that's usually it. And it's enough to go, okay, I get a little bit of a hit. It's like, okay, yeah, I know you all have my back. I know you have always had my back. And I know that this is like everything else, and I'm just having a shitty day. It's not like I'm asking them to make it all go away, make everything better, but there's an awareness of, I am not in this alone. I am in this with the field. I'm not really separate from it. I'm a part of it. I'm a phenomenon that has arisen from it. And so, of course, all these things happen. And this doesn't mean I'm not connected. It doesn't mean that my magic doesn't work. There are days that you're just like, what the fuck is going on? We're in a place in the world right now where there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
You know?
Which is why I think, it's a good time for magic too, because I think it is a tool that can really help people to kind of surf the chaos that seems to be really prevalent right now.
I think it's actually interesting because there's been all these articles for the past maybe 5 years, 6 years about kind of the resurgence of spiritual practice and witchcraft and all this stuff. And you go, yeah, this is what always happens, I think. As things get sketchier and sketchier, people go, how do I tap into power? How do I tap into my personal power? Because I don't feel like I have any control. And there's a lot of people that go, well, that's just, superstition, it's placebo. And my response is always, but placebos work. That's the interesting thing about placebos, right? Placebos are proof of magic.
I think placebos are magic. It's the same principle.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, so a lot of perspectives on magic is that there's a particular kind of lineage or like a current that travels from kind of master to student. What do you think about that? Do you think that do you need to be kind of inoculated with the current of magical energy in order to be able to practice magic?
I'm going to say two different things there. So I'm going to say, I think yes, but I don't think that necessarily has to do with other people. I definitely had a couple of early contacts with magicians, but preceding that by about 5 years is when I had the first connection with kind of power that was really clear. And so I definitely think that, it's not that there's that it's required, but I think that there's a point where everybody finds their place in a current, right? But that current doesn't have much to do with humanity as far as I'm concerned. And so it's again why I think being kind of organic about your process instead of trying to force stuff that doesn't work is really important, because what my allies have gotten really clear about as I've gone on is all like, order a book that I think is cool, I think is interesting, I'll open it up, and the allies are just like, what are you doing? There is no reason for you to read this book. It's like, okay, I know that. And it's not to say I don't read, but it's like I now take that to heart. Like, what is actually speaking to me? What is actually tied into the current? This is why I tend to, I have a lot of connections to kind of Buddhist psychology because it fits the map that I experience. Again, even things like Castaneda. We know Castaneda was making this shit up in a objective real world thing, but he was the first thing that kind of tapped into an explanation of power that made way more sense than, again, what I saw as a 12-year-old in suburban California. I'm like, that world made no sense to me already. And it's when I found Castaneda that I was like, okay, this is crazy shit. But it also makes more sense to me than this world of lawns and little boxy houses and everybody going, taking the train to work. That never made any sense to me. And so I always respect those books for that effect. So yeah,
so like a book could hold the current.
A book can tap you into the current, because everything, and this is one of the things I say a lot, but I do really think it's important, is if I'm right, and this is kind of an imminent experience that's natural to us as humans, this is more a remembering process or a tapping in process than a learning process. And so anything that kind of opens those doors is really key there. There's two brilliant interviews with my friend Meredith Graves on the Glitch Bottle podcast. And in the first one of the things that she says towards the end that I thought was great is she is talking about, she's asked kind of if somebody is new to magic, where should they start? And she says something along the lines of, if you're interested in magic, you probably have an impression of what magic is. And that's where you start. You don't go trying to get somebody to give you that impression. Like, if you already have the impulse to this stuff, what does that seem like to you? What does that feel like to you? What does that look like to you? Because that may be really critical intel about what's going to work for you. And so again, I kind of like, I read the Castaneda stuff as a young person, did a lot of psychedelic drugs as a young person, moved into things like ritual magic, but I'd already started having experiences that were like, I'd go and talk to the ceremonial magicians about it. They'd be like, I don't know what that was. And it's like, what do you mean? You've been doing this for 20 years. What do you mean you've never seen like the gates open when you're out in the woods into other lands or whatever? And I realized like, I already have something here. And I don't know the best way to approach it, but I'm not going to throw it away because it doesn't fit in with this kind of Victorian British take on magic, or this, 30s, 40s British take on witchcraft. I appreciate those things, but they're not my path. And the thing that was funny about it is my path was has proven to be much more aligned to kind of shamanic processes. I'm not an initiate, so I'm never going to claim to be that thing. I'm not working within a tribe, so I think it's inappropriate to claim that thing for me. But yeah, I mean, the current is there. But again, it's that thing we said earlier, I was saying earlier, is the current isn't the same current for everybody. There's tons of different ways in. And it's like whether you want to view that as different cellular structures within the body or different currents flowing within the ocean and the different kinds of beings that are going to exist at the different depths or within the different tide patterns. We're not all the same, and we're going to have to find that place. We're going to have to find that strata that works for us. We're going to have to find those narratives that work for us and those tools that work for us, which is kind of sucky in that you have to do a lot of self-experimentation. There's not going to be one guide for everyone, but it's kind of awesome because it means that you don't have to try and shape yourself to something that doesn't make sense to you.
Mm-hmm. And now things are so accessible. Now things are so accessible. Whereas in the past, maybe if you wanted to get into magic, going through a particular kind of initiatory lodge or something was the only way to do that. But nowadays there's like books on every kind of magic from every culture in the world that are fingertips that we can, order off Amazon and read about and experiment in our own home and try things that work and don't. And that's pretty remarkable. We've never had that at any other time in history, probably.
Right. And I think it is really interesting because, when I was coming up, I guess I started really kind of interacting with magic consciously in 82. And so the things that I knew of were the Temple of Psychic Youth, which I eventually hooked up with, the OTO, which I was in for a while. And then there was a lot of Wicca where I was, and that never really made sense to me. I'm not kind of inspired towards religion. And then things like there was Santeria and stuff, and I never kind of felt comfortable heading that far into somebody else's culture. I know a lot of people who have done that, and it's fine, but for me, it never made sense. And so, I totally went the OTO and then IoT route for quite a while, and then went, okay, I'm done. I am not finding what I want here, but I've kind of gained enough basic comfort with what I do that I'm just going to roll.
I wanted to ask you about that also because, you know, the Sangha is a big part of, say, like Dharma practice and things like that. It's like the belief that if you get a bunch of people that are all kind of working towards the same aims, that gives more juice to the mission. What were your experiences like being a part of magical orders like the IoT or the OTO? And do you think that there is kind of, because magic to me personally feels like quite a solitary kind of personal thing, but I'm also curious about what could happen when you get a lot of people together that are all practicing together. And what were your experiences with group practice and things like that?
I had a really good time in the OTO when I was there. The lodge was run by the first guy that I ever met when I was like 15, who was an actual ceremonial magician, and we'd stayed friends.
Was it in San Francisco?
It was in Oakland, yeah.
Oh, no, cool.
Right on the Oakland-Berkeley border. And so that was, you know, it was crazy. I had joined up 6 months before I moved there. I moved in 5 houses up from the lodge, so I was there all the time. A ton of psychic youths came in and joined up. That's how I actually ended up kind of connecting for real with the Temple of Psychic Youth 5 years after I first contacted them. But the magical stuff never gelled with me. Like I could do it, and it was really interesting to be part of like the Gnostic masses and things like that. But the overall ritual work, there was a lack of coherence for me. It seemed to work very well for most of them. I took part in some public witchcraft stuff, Wiccan stuff, with Covenant of the Goddess and Narugd. And those were really beautiful rituals, and there was some power raised, but again, it was more religious than my thing is. Temple of Psychic Youth was a blast. It was a bunch of crazy people in San Francisco. We ran the access point in San Francisco out of an apartment above the Phuket Thai restaurant. And that was a great time.
Nice.
Really wide open people with a lot of different backgrounds, not necessarily people that would be, not lifer occultists necessarily, but who are very into that thing. You know, we had rattlesnakes. It was cool.
Cool.
The IoT was like the kind of like the last organized thing for me. And it was really good because they had this thing where you would, what they called revels. And the revels would be a bunch of people would get together and would bring their ritual work in and kind of involve everybody else in it to the degree that you could. Or if it was something that was more that you did, you would just do it and they would feed power into it. And I learned a lot from that. There was one temple whose name I've never been able to pronounce even then, that did this kind of very interesting rune work that seemed like almost insectoid. Like the sounds, the way that they vibrated the runes and stuff had this really intense kind of insect vibe to it versus what we usually hear coming out of something like Ward Runa or things like that, you know? And there was something that they did that was a huge benefit for me to witness. And it was also really good to be able to kind of bring my very peculiar hybrids of ceremonial magic and the stuff that I do now into a space to work with people and get feedback from what they experienced. And then kind of the last version of that is we formed the Z cluster, which was a chaos magic thing, not an organization by any stretch of the imagination, but we did a lot of work in New Orleans as a group. And I loved that work. That was really beautiful work. But I find it a solitary path for me. That's not saying that that's for everybody, but for me, it's very much me and the allies. And my engagement with kind of the wider culture is definitely on the writing end or on the talismanic end. That's a kind of transmission that I'm comfortable with. It makes sense to me and kind of the ecosystem of allies that I'm in. They're very clear about the stuff that I do and don't do. And this is not like they're saying, don't do that. It's more that there's just kind of guidance like, yeah, we're into it. Nah, you can do that if you want to. They've never said, no, don't do something. It's not like I'm ruled by my allies, but I'm always very interested in their feedback, and it will shape how things happen a lot. But yeah, for me, it's very much, I learned a lot playing with other people, but I do better work by myself.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I don't have a lot of time left, and I want to be respectful of your time as well, but I wanted to ask as a closing question, if you had any kind of general words of wisdom from your many years on the path for those that might be just starting out in the practice of magic.
I mean, the thing that I always preach is like, deep and narrow is really good. We're in this super data-driven culture, and there is a tendency to want to just amass information, and information has a very limited utility in the sense of kind of study of systems and trying to integrate more and more, and practice is everything. So to me, is find the things that you will do a lot and that you like, and just go whole hog into those. I'm working on a podcast on this subject, which I'll probably record this weekend. But yeah, that's the thing that I think is the hardest right now. Again, in the 80s, there wasn't nearly as much information. It was much harder to get. So I think that I was really blessed that I spent sometimes 10 years working within a very few practices, because I got to kind of really milk those and live with them long enough for them to grow up and us to grow up together, and for them to evolve and either fall away or transform. And that's the thing that I think is the most important that I can think of. Find something that really calls to you. You don't need a different spell for everything if you have one way of working that works. And that could be a way of doing candle magic or sigil magic. And see what you can do with that. Knowing more ways doesn't necessarily help. Ties into kind of the Buddhist thing again. It's not, you don't keep learning ways to meditate. You get better at it, and it deepens. And that's very true in my experience of magic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that something that came across with your book is just that you really go at it from the heart. You know, you're not trying to conform to a particular system that's been pre-established or anything. And I think that that's really important. It's like everybody has their magic, and it's kind of their path to discover what their magic for them personally is. And that's going to look different to every person. And there's no real hard and fast rules about this is the right way to do something and this isn't.
Yeah, there are lots of people who will happily tell you that this is not so.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, it's how do you be in love with someone? You know, what's the right way?
Well, thank you, Aidan. This is a blast. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
All right. Well, yeah, I wish you the best evening you could possibly have tonight. And yeah, I'll get this up soon, and I'm looking forward to sharing it. Thanks for calling upon your allies for giving extra charge to this podcast. Absolutely. And thank you for having me. It's great. So. Yeah, man. All right. Thank you. You have an excellent day, Jake. You too. Bye-bye. The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.